Well, welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. My guest today, he's played both a historic character and fictional people. Welcome, Michael Cawelti, and thanks for being here today.
Oh, you bet, Dan. This is going to be fun.
But before we talk about those issues, I'd like to ask you the traditional Fair Folk at Work first question, which is, who was the person who told you about there was this thing called Faire, and what did they say to get you out there?
Well, it's a little different an answer for me. I grew up trapped in a middle class existence that had no fun in it whatsoever and knew that I didn't quite belong there, but was playing the game. And a friend of mine said, "Hey, they have this Renaissance fair going on." I was in college, so this was probably 1976 down in San Diego, and the Agura Fair was happening. He says, "Hey, we should go." And so we were both fencers, so that was kind of our connection to the fantasy of musketeers and all that sort of thing. And so we put on costumes that were absolutely horrid. I remember folding up my jeans so it looked like there was a fold in my boots. I had a 70s frill front shirt, a cowboy hat that was pinned up with an ostrich feather in it. And then I made a vinyl sling for my fencing foil, and that was my outfit. And so we went to this amazing, oh, what a brave new world with such people in it, to quote Shakespeare. Therefore, the person that we really need to talk about for why I do this, it looked just so cool, but I was audience member. I didn't really think you could join stuff like that. And then Will Wood, who was the master of the revels, walked by and just in 5 seconds went, "Hello, hi, how are you? You look great. Welcome to Fair," and then wandered off as he is meet to do. He's the master of the hit and run. And I thought, oh my God, this is a cool place. So the next year I had to figure out how to get in.
What was your major in college before you came to Faire?
I grew up in a household where my dad was a businessman and he wanted nothing to do with anything theatrical and said, "You got to get a job. You've got to have a career." He was a businessman and I knew that wasn't right for me. So when I was in college, I started off doing the sensible thing and I wanted to be a scientist, a geologist. And then I found out I was no good at calculus whatsoever and said, "You know what? Maybe this isn't for me." So I thought the in between theater and a real job would be journalism. So I was a writer. I could tell stories pretty well. So I thought, well, I'll be a journalist. And then two things happened. One, we got a visit from a TV personality at the local news station. And this woman had more makeup on than Bozo the Clown and was the most fake individual that I had ever seen in my very young years. And I wasn't all that perceptive about that stuff back in those days. I kind of took everything at face value. And I went, oh my God, I don't want to turn into something like that. And then the school lost its accreditation for the journalism department. I went, nope, I'm not going to continue with this. Well, luckily, I was a English literature minor the whole time. And I figured out that I could still graduate in 4 years by being an English literature major. So I switched over. And that goes to my sense of history. And then I had a few leftover classes that I could take anything I wanted in my final year. So I thought, oh, I'm going to take theater. So I got into theater and did some really great stuff and realized, oh, this is where I belong. And after doing the Renaissance Fair, my last 2 years of college, I ran away with the circus, literally. I had met Marilyn Prince in my final year there,
Right.
who's now Letchworth. We became boyfriend and girlfriend, and she wanted to be an actor, and I wanted to be an actor. And we ran off and tried to do it all, which led to doing Dickens Fair back in 77, and myself going, I just want to stay. And so I did. I stayed in San Francisco.
The other related question is talk about how you got into fencing.
You know what? I realize now I've lived my life through fantasy the whole time. I always found a way of taking what I wanted to be from movies and finding a way to do it in real life, mostly as a hobby. But when it came to literally wanting to be a musketeer, the Three and Four Musketeers came out, which, in my opinion, were the greatest films ever made. And those influenced me incredibly. I wanted to be a musketeer. That's literally what I wanted to do. I also grew up wanting to be Robin Hood and Roy Rogers and John Wayne and all of that. So the first thing I did was I wanted to be a musketeer, so I got onto the fencing team. Well, it just so happened at San Diego State, the teacher of fencing was Hisaburo Okawa, who was the seventh greatest fencer in the world and happened to run the Moray Academy in Los Angeles. And as a side gig, he went down to Fullerton and San Diego State to teach classes and make money. And he was the first person I had ever met in my life who was a master of something. I mean, there was, you felt it, you saw it. He was cool. He didn't have to show you anything. He just was the thing. And it was like, wow. And then when I shifted to theater, I realized, oh, well, there's this thing called stage combat. Well, back in the late 70s, early 80s, stage combat was still just Errol Flynn, bish bash bosh, light rapiers and witty talk, but not very realistic. Well, during this period is when William Hobbs started doing films. He did the Three and Four Musketeers, by the way. But William Hobbs was the first one to do realistic swordplay in the movies. And I'll tell you what did it for me. It was the film production of Macbeth that Roman Polanski did. But really, what was unique about it was this new form of stage combat where it was ultra realism. I finished my college career. I went to graduate school because I was up in San Francisco. And San Francisco State at the time was one of the greatest drama schools in all of America. I went to school with Annette Bening, Michael McShane, Greg Proops, Brian Lohman, Reed Rallman. And I took a class from Chenoweth. Included in it was a week of stage combat. And I went home on fire. I handwrote 25 pages about how I had a better system. And I took it to him, and he was a bit of a sarcastic jerk at times. And he said, oh, nice. Well, I'll tell you what, when you teach your own class, you can do this stuff. And I went, okay, challenge accepted. And I found out as a graduate student, I could teach a semester-long class as long as I had a sponsor from the regular faculty. So I took this to the dance instructor who said, I don't know anything about this, but I think I want to take your class. So I worked out this whole 16-week class on stage combat, and Annette and Michael and everybody, John Stamos and a bunch of people were in the class. And in the meantime, before I started the class, I took this trip to England. And while I was there, I kind of met everybody in the swordplay game. I got to meet William Hobbs. I got to meet the armorer of the Old Vic Theater, the guy who repaired Laurence Olivier's Oscar when it broke. It was just an amazing cast of characters who, by the way, Reg Amos introduced me to the Keeper of the Blade of the Tower of London. So in 1980, this 22-year-old kid walks up to the back entrance of the Tower of London, and there's a beefeater there, and he says, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I have an appointment with the Keeper of the Blades." And he goes, "Oh, you do you?" And then he makes a phone call and he goes, "Well, apparently you do." So he showed me in. The Keeper of the Blades, very polite, handed me a pair of white gloves. He said, "This is my assistant. Go play." And in those days, all the rooms in the tower were storage rooms for all of the everyday weapons. And they really had no place to put all this workaday stuff. And I got to wander around picking up all the swords of antiquity. I mean, there were fencing blades stamped Angelo on them, which is the famous 18th century school. But anyway, so I got to do all this and then came back to state and taught this class.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yes.
What was your innovative philosophy in teaching stage combat that was new and different? And what was your take at that age on what stage combat should be?
Well, that was the whole thing. I saw the films of William Hobbs. I talked to William Hobbs, and his whole concept was it's meant to be realistic. For example, the violence in Shakespeare is not there to make you feel violence is cool and you're a superhero when you do it. It's there to go, oh, fuck, These people are trying to kill each other. They're trying to take over kingdoms. They're cruel. So that realism wasn't really present before Hobbes. But my whole saying was, my innovative approach to it was, if the two characters believe they can die, you have a realistic sword fight. And so I took his stuff, came up with my own stuff, and that became my career. I was trying to be an actor professionally. I was hired before Annette Bening was out of college to be in professional theater. But it was the stage combat end of things that everybody just stood up and went, "What is this?" I ended up winning 4 Drama Critics Circle Awards, 3 Bernie Awards from the Chronicle. It was a great career because nobody had seen anything like that before. I remember one day Annette Bening calling me up and saying, "Hey, congratulations on your genius status." And I go, "What are you talking about?" She goes, "Read the Examiner." And Nancy Scott, who was the great theater critic from the SF Examiner, she had reviewed one of the Shakespeare productions, and in it she said, "Choreographed ably by that genius of stage combat, Michael Cawelti." So that's how I got into swordplay. It
Let me
literally,
just ask one more question because I am
yeah,
really
yeah.
fascinated by all this. Can you give me an example of a fencing exercise that you taught that makes the actor respond as if they are really in danger to give that sense of realism?
Sure. One of the concepts I got in conversation, also John Waller was another great fight director in England who I got to spend time with while I was there. He choreographed Monty Python and the Holy Grail. One of the things besides realism that I got from is this concept. I didn't call myself a fight choreographer. I called myself a fight director. And I was the first one to use that term. Why? Because when I went into it, we did the physicality, but the physicality had to be an extension of the character and the story. You weren't watching swordplay, you were watching two characters fight. And the ebb and flow of how that character interaction went is how it becomes realistic. Because you're not doing what I used to call timeout for physicality. You are continuing the play through the characterizations. And when you do that and direct the people in terms of how they act the fight, then you get realistic fighting. And I think that's what I brought to it overall. Now it's kind of de rigueur. Everybody does it.
Circling back to the world of the Renaissance fair, are there any connections between the fair and your fencing philosophy? I mean, the fair is another example of an immersive theater where, in theory, you are a character
Mhm.
inhabiting a different world.
Right.
In your fencing philosophy, the actors are in that world and reacting as if that world was real. Does that make sense?
It
Or
does. It does. I think that acting, doing living history, or whether you're on a play or in a movie, you have to believe who you are and convince the audience that you are that character. I think great acting is a combination of method acting where you lose yourself in the character, but at the same time, you've got to hit your marks. So I think you're always aware that you're in a play and you have duties, but you immerse yourself in the character so much that you believe it while you're on stage, and then the audience just goes right along. And the best people like Kevin Brown, who ever did Living History, was somebody who totally immersed himself in the role. And also, he was a character actor. He was different for every role. His head of the acting troupe, None Such Players, was not the same as his Lord Leicester. Was not as same as the general who ran the military. I mean, these were different characterizations. And he was quite brilliant at that, actually.
what other actors or shows that you saw out at fair made you go, okay, I want to do that? Basically,
So,
who were your mentors and what did you
right.
learn from them?
I came to the fair first as a fantasist, And then when I came back after a couple years off of doing professional theater, I came back as a professional actor, and that was the eye I looked at. Now, at the fair, the people on the stage, Fratelli Bologna and Cock and Feathers, and all those people were kind of the gods of fair. So I knew that on the stage was where you were going to make your mark. And so people like Judy Corey, the guys from the Wizards show, Sandy and Mark Hugh, and Will Wood, the way he could stay in character was brilliant. Scott Beach was slightly before my time, but he was still around. David Springhorn was brilliant. He was an asshole, but he was brilliant. He was really great at that form of theater, which was new to the world. Basically, I've always had a problem with people who you say Renaissance fair to them and they go, you mean that amateur theater stuff? Because every representation of a Renaissance fair in a movie is a bunch of dweebs. Only the people who went to these fairs with a critical eye understood is these were professionals that were pulling off something that was realistic and amazing, entertaining. It was another level, but it never got that kind of respect from legitimate theater. And I had done both worlds. And it kind of pissed me off because some of the work, not all of it, but some of the work that were done at these main fairs that the Living History did, they had amazing actors. Annie Lore, in the old days of the Commedia with Billy Scudder and Judy Corey. In the 70s, when I came up as this young man and I said, I want to get on the stage, Judy Corey leaned over to me and says, take it from me. That was the approach. It's like, you want to be on the stage? You're going to have to be better than I am to get this spot on the stage. In other words, it was high level. There was no coddling. There were no, well, everybody was good except this guy. If you wanted to get on that stage, you had to bring it. And that kind of quality and the ambition you had to do to pull it off created some of the greatest acts. I mean, Shields and Yarnell used to do the fair. The brothers Karamazov started at the fair. Firesign Theater started at the fair. These are all people that went on to great things. Mark Hamill did the fair in his younger years. Robin Williams, bunch of people that had a new outlet for their performing. That level of performer was there at the fair, even if they didn't achieve fame the way some of them did.
How would you define the Faire acting style and what was innovative about it?
You're on stage for 8 hours a day. That's unique. Two, you're outdoors. And that could mean you could be a foot away from your audience, or you could be 100 feet away from your audience. So it was a form of outdoor theater, much like you'd do in a big amphitheater doing Shakespeare. So you had to have the chops to pull that off. And also, you had to interpret through a lens. This infected everybody's approach to whatever character they played. It's the Renaissance pleasure fair. This is not the Renaissance of decaying bodies in the streets and awash with urine and things like that. This was like the happiest time. It was spring, it was fall festival. Everybody's having a good time. Everybody's wearing their best clothes. It was kind of an immersive experience for the actors as well as the audience, but the audience went home and the actors kept in it. They weren't in character anymore, but they were still living this very large, amazing life. One of the things too that made the Renaissance Fair different in the 70s and 80s and the 60s too, were the sexual revolution, where you could be bawdy. You could reference a woman's cleavage and everybody laughed and had a good time with it. Nothing wrong was going on, but I think society has gotten back into a kind of a puritanical mode where a lot of that stuff is not acceptable the way it used to be. So that was very freeing for the actors and for the audience as well back in those days.
In the relative joys of making an audience laugh, what gives you the greater joy, and what is the joy of performing for 600 people versus the joy for performing for two?
I'm going to answer that from a standpoint of comedy.
Okay.
I'm a pretty good dramatic actor. I've done some pretty interesting stuff that got a lot of acclaim, but comedy is hard. And to me, comedy was always the high point of entertaining people. And as a writer, director, and actor of comedy, the Faire has given me opportunities to hone my craft in front of a real audience that I never would have got otherwise. And that was both with individuals, where quite honestly, when I'm more one-on-one in the streets, it's more about improv. How are you able to take impetus and make that into comedy, or to make their day, or to make them feel great about themselves? How can you take that input and turn it back around in a professional manner, for lack of saying anything else? Whereas when you got on the stage, it was all about the craft of writing and performing. And it's different genres, and they're both equally really important. But I always responded, even though I had a great time in the streets, I've always considered myself a stage actor at the Faire, because that's where you can control things, a narrative. And I guess because that's my mindset as a director, I want to just create this. It's almost like a film director. I want to create this thing and give it to you and see what you think. And when you've got 600 people laughing their minds out at the stuff that you created with your fellow actors, it's like, oh my God, there's no better feeling. I used to have people in the legitimate theater say, "Oh, you do Renaissance fairs?" And I said, "Mr. Professional Actor, let me point something out to you. The show I created, Manly Men in Tights, we estimated once we played before 750,000 people over the 17-year run. Every show, people laughed over 60 times in a half hour, and I got paid for it. You're telling me this is amateur theater?"
What shows did you look around at when you were coming up with Manly Men in Tights?
Well, it was more of a style. There was a group called Once in Favor, and they did like The Miller's Tale from Chaucer, but it was a funny version. And Marilyn Prince and John Copeland, who went on to produce Babylon 5, the guy who did lighting for Disneyland, I'm forgetting his name now, Boros, they had a great show. There was a group called Thieves Theater, who was hysterical. This is pre-reduced Shakespeare. But they were doing this kind of theater. The theater that became reduced Shakespeare already existed as a genre at the Faire, including the Wizard Show. It was a type of theater. It broke the fourth wall. It was silly. It was very engaging. And it also kind of did things you didn't expect from a standard fairy tale. So those are the people that I looked up to. The Santa Barbara Fair was one of the fairs where the Renaissance Fair tried to make a comeback. But that fair brought all the old fair people from LA out. And it was just so good to see all those brilliant minds. And I remember being at the Moulah's Cafe one morning, and Dan Singer was there, and he announced to everybody, he said, Michael Cawelti could have been in reduced Shakespeare, but he turned us down. And I looked at him and I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, you remember when we did the Dickens Fair on Fort Mason, and what happened? This is in the 70s. I was the house manager. Dan Singer was the stage manager, and there was nobody on our stage. So what we did is we got up on stage and tried to entertain people, and that's where we came up with him playing Juliet in drag and me playing Romeo, and just kind of improving our way through a version of the play." And he told me later that was the impetus for reduced Shakespeare for him. And I think he said to me once, "We're going to pursue this thing down in LA. Why don't you come down?" And I said, "No, I'm living up here now. I kind of like it." So I guess that's what he meant. But I love those guys, and I just adored those guys. And I really didn't get to know Jess, or I knew Adam somewhat, but Dan was the guy I really knew. I loved what they did, and I said, I can do something like that. And then I wrote a bunch of plays for the Fair. The Icy Coxcrow with Craig Fleming, who was the head writer for Euro Disney later on in life. And I did a play once called The Night of the Burning Pestle, which is this really obscure Elizabethan play that I turned into a half-hour comedy, and Shannon Derry was in that. On paper, it was the wittiest, coolest thing you'd ever read in your life, and it totally bombed on stage. And so we learned all kinds of lessons back in those days. But then I saw a production of The Swordsman from back east, and I go, oh, it's a play about nothing. I could write something like that. And we got accused of stealing it from them, by the way. But there was absolutely nothing that was the same in their play that it was in mine. I just took it as a concept of how to make a play. So Jonathan Graff, who was the Lord Mayor and a good comedy writer himself, we sat down and wrote Manly Men in Tights. I will tell you that both of us were doing 6 shows a day at the Northern Renaissance Fair. And we got Leslie, the producer, to agree to do 1 show a day of this new show we wanted to try on the Inyard stage, which was not the best stage because it was a huge area and there was lots of noise pollution. We went out and did this show, and people applauded. We thought, oh, well, that's great. That went pretty well. We came back on Sunday. We walked out on stage, and there were 500 people in the audience applauding us as we walked on stage. And we looked at each other and said, what the hell did we do? And it was almost like we had no idea it was going to be what it was going to be. We were all making these attempts at doing some great theater. And I remember going to see Fratelli Bologna, where all the old gang came back that year when we first started doing Manly Men. And Mark, the storyteller, Mark Lewis, who I adored, we were halberdiers together in the early days of Faire. He did the show. They got huge applause. And at the end of the show, they go, that's what the Faire's all about. And Mark Lewis stopped the crowd and said, no, you want to see what the Faire's all about? Go see Manly Men in Tights. And I was like floored. I thought, where is this coming from? And over the 17 years, I continued to improve the script so that basically it was mostly all punchlines. It was a very crude show when we first started. And after about 4 years, Jonathan got tired of it and moved on. So I took it on, and I was in every production that ever was and directed it. And
Can I interrupt for a sec? What was the underlying concept of Manly Men in Tights? And can you describe the show for us?
It's about 3 guys filled with testosterone in a kind of a Dudley Do-Right way, who are showing off to the audience how manly they are, and more importantly, getting the audience to join in. Because there was audience interaction in the piece. We would go out into the audience. It was a bunch of guys who thought they were the manliest men on the planet who were pretty ridiculous. It was funny because women seemed to enjoy the show more than men did, but they all got dragged along because of their girlfriends, and they had a good time too. It was swordplay. It was getting the audience up on their feet and doing a bunch of dick jokes with little swords in their hands, having everybody do stuff in unison.
What did you have them do in unison, and what bits propelled you out into the audience during the show?
Well, we would have standard bits, but when I did things, I improv till I found the right wording, and then it was cemented. So the play at the end was a lot less improvisational and much more very specific comedy. And so when we would have bits where we go out in the audience, there was a wooing competition. And so we would go out and the Spaniards who interrupt the show and say, you're not manly, we are far more manly than you. Well, it got to be a contest, and we would go out and each woo a woman. And we, in the early days, we got a ringer to come on stage. The guy playing Tony, who played Sir Walter Raleigh, who was this dreamboat of a physical specimen, would come out and woo the woman for us, whereas the Spaniard was totally fantastical and just comedy. That would be a gig. We got a bunch of guys up on stage to teach them how to be manly, and we used little wooden swords, and we had them pose and lunge and do all this stuff in unison. And like I said, there were a lot of dick jokes involved. And the audience was going crazy because their own people were up there. And the thing was, I had a philosophy about how to write the show. One of the reasons that Jonathan and I parted company is because Jonathan was really good at put-down humor. He could put you in your place. He could tell a joke on you. You'd still laugh, but he was totally insulting you. And as we figured out what this play was, I realized there was no room for that comedy in this show. Everything had to be about us being ridiculous, not about the audience. So everything had to be very happy and coming from a place of just positive.
I
That's where
agree
the
100%, by the way.
Mhm.
And I think Mark and our shows were exactly the same. The
Exactly.
idea is that you are creating a bond between you and the audience. You're creating an us, and the source of the humor is basically how silly we are.
I have a comment.
Okay.
Um, I think you've hit on something very important. Phyllis set up a world, and Ron in the early days, where it was about joy. And that's what you got when you went there. Well, you went there to just participate in this amazing party that every friend you know wishes they were at. That kind of positive thing happened organically. Phyllis didn't go around telling actors how to do stuff. But whether it was the obscene juggler or reduced Shakespeare or once in favor, all of these groups just figured out that was the way to approach this. It was organic. It just came out of everyone because that's what you saw. That's what you wanted to emulate. That's what you were influenced by. That's what you wanted to create in terms of that warm, fuzzy feeling with all those audience members.
Another nice thing to say about the Pattersons is that when you look at historic theatrical reconstructions in the early 60s that they were responding to,
Mhm.
you had very top-down observational things like colonial Williamsburg. Around the village square and you looked in a cabin and somebody was banging on a piece of metal and they would say, welcome to, and then they would just talk at you. They had their approved script. So it was very top down. And the other thing that was happening at the time was, of course, Disneyland. Disneyland was is very top down, and great moments with Mr. Lincoln as a robot.
Mhm.
And what Phyllis et al. Did was say, here's the basic framework. Go. And I
Yeah.
think that is what the sort of bottom up miracle of the Faire is, that it's almost self-replicating because people are always going to like that creativity within that framework.
Absolutely. Well, it was a very unique opportunity. And, I still think of myself as the kid at Renaissance and Dickens fairs. And now I look around and it's like I'm like three generations past some of the people that are doing it. And I know all of those old people and they go, who? It's like I was standing in line waiting for tofu nuggets at the Dickens fair. And this woman starts talking to me and I turn around and I go, it's Annie Lore. And she was one of those icons from the 70s. And she has this personal thing where she loves to take stereographic photographs. And she had figured out how to put iPhones in a wrapped Christmas package and take stereophone pictures of people and reproduce what the old cameras would do. And, that was just her weird little thing that she loved to do. But there was Annie Lore. She was one of those original people. And I knew who she was. And you know what? I probably would have become an actor no matter what. I probably would have become a fight director no matter what. But I wouldn't have been as good as an actor or a director of actors if I had not done the fairs. That improv situation, that honing your writing in front of those huge, accepting crowds, you could try stuff. And, it didn't always work. But when it worked, you knew it, and that was an incredible lesson. So I really give a lot of credit to that genre for being a pro at what I do. Yeah,
But I'd
and
like to
Andy was
change
there.
topic a little bit. You have had the experience of being both a fictional character and it's Teddy Roosevelt, right?
Well, I played that as an actor. I did keynote speeches as Theodore Roosevelt for about 15 years out in the world. The only time I played Roosevelt for the Pattersons was at their rail fair, and I spoke off the back of a train, which was really a lot of fun. But I played William Shakespeare for 10 years for the big fairs. That was kind of my entree into historical figures. And, I studied Shakespeare in school. I was a reader at the Huntington Library studying Shakespeare. I was in a professional Shakespearean company, the Berkeley Shakespeare Festival, for 14 years. So I knew a lot about Shakespeare, and this was my interpretation of him on a good day at a fair. And it was all about wit. And that is how I approached it. There's been a lot of Shakespeare's, and they all kind of approach it differently. Some are silly, some are just balls of energy, some are brooding in the corner, coming up with Hamlet. My whole thing was engaging people and being witty.
How being William Shakespeare as opposed to Joe Peasant on the street, what are the strengths and weaknesses, and how does it feel as an actor to make your choices as Joe Peasant on the street versus William Shakespeare?
I think you choose a character because you're not cast as something. You kind of choose who you want to be. And I think that goes to who you are. There are people that in their life are everyman. They just want to be that solid peasant and make their world of theater from that emanating space. I had a very different idea of who I was. I always thought of myself as a theme character, a noble, somebody who was in the spotlight at the top. It was just my nature. And so when I picked characters, they weren't obscure people. I played Raleigh, I played Shakespeare, I played an Italian nobleman. That's what I gravitated to. When you play an anonymous character, you can have an amazing impact on an audience. I think her name was Amy, who used to do what we called the slow walker. This was a woman who was in rags, who would just very slowly walk through the fair, and she was obviously insane, but very kind. And people were just drawn to her, and she was totally immersed in the character. And she had this huge effect on people, where I loved the support of playing a theme character. When everybody else is supporting you as that person, that gives you a bigger megaphone, and you can do more for more people. And that's what I liked about playing, if you will, famous people.
Is there part of your brain that said, oh, William Shakespeare would never say that? I'm William Shakespeare, so I have to act in a certain way. Whereas opposed, if you were Bob on the street, you could say, God, you good in, or,
Yeah, no. I think you figure out what the parameters are based on the character's history. He was an educated man. He was ambitious. He was a wordsmith. He loved the play of language. He was always trying to lever up into higher ends of society, make money, all of those, middle class virtues and drives. And once you understand where you're coming from and how to manipulate the language, see, I did something that was a little different. For example, Greg, who you mentioned before, was definitely part of the Kevin Brown crowd.
right.
I admired those people so much because they picked a character, and literally they could have done it at Plymouth Plantation, because that was exactly who that person was. That's exactly what they would have said. I chose a different path. I chose a path where I wanted the customer to relate to the comedy I was giving them. And the best example of this is Manly Men in Tights used to have a joke where we would tell people how to be a manly position, and we would raise up our arms and go, sure, this is how you are sure of yourself. And then we would do sure, unsure, sure. And what is that? That's a commercial for a deodorant that went on for like 20 years, and everybody in the audience knew that, and they lost themselves. I did not do anything unperiod, but I made a connection between my history and their history, which gave them more of a permission to be part of the experience. In other words, Shakespeare's comedy is really funny if you're an Elizabethan. If you're a 20th century person, it's dull as dishwater because nobody gets the references anymore. So I used modern references couched in historical context to bring the audience along, which is a very different approach. But I think that's why those shows were so popular. And I used to have this argument with Phyllis all the time because she thought everything should be absolutely pure. But a lot of the things that she picked as pure were really just her fantasy about how it went back in those days. So I used that as permission to do my own version of this. And it was extremely popular. I still work for the Pattersons 46 years later, so they haven't fired me yet. That makes sense? Did that?
It makes perfect sense. It's hot, it's dusty, they're in the sun, they're drinking beer, and there's a lot of things going on, and they're not going to follow the permutations of the elegant language, as witty as they are.
You know what, though? That is part of your learning experience. There were no rules for doing stage shows on a Renaissance fair back in those days. It's like you saw what everybody else did. You saw what they did well. You didn't want to copy the material, but you copied the style. That's what I
Yes.
said to somebody once. It's like everybody's doing a commedia. It's no longer an Italian commedia from the 15th century, but it's in the style of a commedia. And you learn what you can get away with the audience. You invent new things. I think all kinds of theater was invented in those days because everybody was just allowed to be creative in a venue where you had a built-in audience. You didn't have to write a play, rent a theater, and then convince people to come see it and hope they like it. Everybody came to that location to have a good time, and they were really open to what you were doing.
I'm going to try a couple of improv theater games if you'd like. Sometimes these work, sometimes these don't.
Okay.
Imagine a world that the Renaissance Fair does not exist. Young Michael Cawelti, 17. Imagining Michael at age 28, an overnight sensation, and he's won an Academy Award. So like you're in the shower, you're daydreaming and think, in 10 years, I'm going to be an overnight sensation and I'm going to win the Academy Award and fill in the blank. I am the fawning People magazine article writer here to interview young Michael as for winning the Academy Award. At age 17 would have been your, when I've done this.
I know what the answer should be just in terms of the context, but I didn't dream of that when I was 17. I kind of got that when I was 21 and then succeeded pretty much to live that life. I didn't get an Academy Award. I got the local version of it. So that would be to me as a fight director. At 17, I wanted to be an actor, but I didn't
Okay.
even know I had permission yet to be an actor. I was still influenced by my upbringing where they told me, you can't seriously do that. You can't make a living. Nobody was ever going to marry you if you didn't have a good income. All of that stuff was still in my head. But by the time I was 21, it's like, no, I've seen this world. It's possible.
Why don't we try this? Why don't we give you the Academy Award in original screenplay?
Awesome.
Well, congratulations, Mr. Cawelti, on your Best Original Screenplay Academy Award.
Thank you.
One thing that everyone says about you is that you are a favorite both with the critics and the wider general audience. What in your writing do you think makes you have this broad appeal?
Well, I would say, first of all, if you come from a traditional literature background, which I did, you understand the game that the critics are judging you on, or the great films, knowing those scripts. That's what they're judging you on. Now, I wouldn't say that I try to please them. I don't write things for critics. I write them for an audience. And that is why they're popular, is because people can relate, people can observe the cleverness of the script, they can see that they're actually real people. The dialogue is human and realistic. But when you come from a background of understanding the classics, whether it's in literature or film, it's a language that critics understand.
What for you is a classic film script?
So many. The Conversation with Gene Hackman, brilliant film. Subdued. You don't even really notice going from place to place in the film. It's about a relationship. It's a thriller, but it's not an action film. It's about conversations and interactions of people. I think that's one of the great scripts that comes to mind. I mean, The Godfather, the original one, especially, a great story told through really unique and interesting characters.
If you could have anyone in Hollywood be in your movie, who would you call?
This is going to sound kind of a little fanboyish, but I got to tell you, Brad Pitt impresses the hell out of me as an actor. He's so good looking that everybody wants to discount what he does. He just did that movie Bullet Train, and it's an action film, but he's hysterical in it. And that's because he is playing comedy from within a character that is not designed to be comedy, which is the best comedy there is. You don't want to go, hey, look at this. This is funny. Comedy comes from situation and character, and he's brilliant at it. And that's hard to do. So I just love him in films.
I'd like to try another one.
Sure.
Once again, you're playing you, but this time you're sort of your age. We'll call it Thanksgiving. You're all sitting around the table eating the meal, and your niece, Zoe, 14 years old, pipes up and says, I want to do the Renaissance Fair just like Uncle Michael, because he has all those fun stories. Your sister puts down her napkin and looks at you and says, yes, Michael, tell me why the apple of my eye, my beloved daughter, should do the Renaissance Fair. And you say,
because it is a chance to embrace the world with open arms. A lot of kids are locked into their phones. A lot of kids are insular. They don't interact with other people. You get to experience putting your personality on a bigger stage. You get to experience communicating with people on a bigger area. And sis, I know you know this, but I used to play Theodore Roosevelt, and I have literally done speeches that I wrote whole cloth for Theodore Roosevelt to talk about, who people later came and said, oh my God, tell me where I can find that speech, because that's one of my favorite speeches I've ever heard of Theodore Roosevelt's. And it's not. It's just something I created. I did it for 1,000 people. They were just enwrapped. I got paid for it. I got lots of love for it. I never would have been able to do that had I not done the Renaissance Fair. Another story, I'm a traditional archer. I literally win awards in archery competitions, and I shoot a longbow because I wanted to be Robin Hood too. And you know what? I remember going to the biggest archery competition in the world. It's called the Big Shoot in Las Vegas. And in my shooting group was a guy who is the guru of controlling target panic and focus. Mr. Turner is an amazing man. And he gets people to not be nervous, basically, in a competition or in front of people. At that shoot, there were 175 archers on the line, and I was very aware several times that I was the last one shooting an arrow. And I knew that everyone in that arena was looking at me, and it didn't bother me. And it was the opposite of what Joel has to teach people to do. And I said, why is that? He goes, are you a public speaker? I go, yeah. Says, that's why crowds don't bother you. The fear of public speaking is one of the greatest fears in the American public. You can do the Renaissance Fair. You don't have that problem. Absolutely. It's something that's foreign to me, that people have a problem talking publicly. And it always surprises me when people remind me that that thing is out there.
The other thing I see at Manifest Sales, and you can comment on this, is that people don't like public speaking because they assume their audience is critical.
Mm-hmm.
And working out at the fair, I would say maybe one person in 1,000 is like that, but you have 999 other people who just want to be entertained. They want you to
Right.
do well,
Mm-hmm.
and that's something you get at the fair.
Well, it's the same idea if you've got a great crowd as a comedian and everybody's laughing, but then you have a heckler. Being able to handle that heckler is an art all by itself. And the best at it, the Robin Williams and people like that would just turn them into mush. And then you've taken this adverse situation and turned it to your betterment, and everybody's having even more of a good time. So it's not always just about being able to handle an enduring crowd. You get to understand what to do with people that are trying to mess with you too. It reminds me of when I was in London and I saw Sir Ralph Richardson in a David Story play about an aging prime minister. I went to a matinee. There was probably 30 people in this huge audience. It was like nobody there. But I was seeing Ralph Richardson perform. This was just amazing. And there's this long monologue that he has by himself. And as soon as he got into the monologue, there was a guy in the audience who started coughing. And not only did he not stop coughing, he didn't leave. And Ralph Richardson, total fourth wall, there's no audience out there, in his speech, changed his focus and pinpointed that guy in the audience. And without breaking the fourth wall, made him feel so uncomfortable that he got up and left the theater. And never once did anybody have any inkling that he wasn't doing what he did every night, but I could see it. And it was just masterful. It's like, holy shit. Because he didn't break character, he didn't stop the play. It was like, oh man, that's somebody who's been around the block.
That's why you go to the theater, right?
It's not a movie.
I'm getting towards the end of my words, and I had sort of like to stop talking when I run out of words. So when you were kind enough to do this interview and you said yes, and then hopefully the next thought you thought to yourself was, I got to be sure to mention so and so. This is your I forgot to mention so and so moment that you can throw in there.
I've always been good at improv. And if I literally had that sit down in the talk show after winning an Academy Award, I would never think about planning anything to say. I had nothing in mind when I did this. I thought, oh, great, we're going to talk about the old days at the fair. And all this stuff is in extempore for me. That's kind of how I work. But as you bring it up, there are so many thank yous for all the great performers I saw on the stage that helped me hone my craft. David Springhorn was a mentor at first. He kind of changed later, and now he's back to being Mr. Namaste and all is good with the world. But he got kind of angry there for a little while. But so many people, Andy, all the old fair shows, Daniel Singer and Jess and all those guys for the work they did on the stage. There were so many people that just were the best version of themselves through a character. And there were 40 to 60 of them that you saw every day. And they were all there doing their best work. And it was inspirational. I learned by watching other people. I watched a lot of old comedy, Jack Benny, I Love Lucy. Those people were great comedians. Their sense of timing, I learned from them. Gentle humor of Ollie and Stan versus the slapstick of the Three Stooges versus the insane disruption of the Marx Brothers. I mean, all of it just went into the mind and was a source to be creative with. It's very funny because you asked me a question about my original screen play, and I went, "Oh, that's totally the wrong award for me," because you know what? I always have references. I always use those great sources that if anybody was schooled well enough, they could see them in there. But for most people, it's a whole cloth new experience. So I'm always very thankful of my teachers, and a lot of them didn't even know they were my teachers. So there's that. I mean, Kevin Brown, Mr. Dickens from Dickens Faire, Why am I forgetting one of my best friend's names? Anyway, they were just amazing people at being a character. Then there were amazing people at creating improvised comedy. There were people that were great out of doing the same lines every day and making it fresh and just perfect for an audience. I learned from all those people. And I learned from going to see plays, from going to see comedians. I did improv theater when I first came to San Francisco and worked opposite Robin Williams and Michael McShane and people like that whose comic timing and just, the ability to think so fast. All of it was admirable. And I just kind of took it all in and put it in the blender of my head, and what I do as an artist comes out from that. So it's thanks to everybody, really, and thanks to Phyllis and Ron for creating an environment. Thanks to Kevin and Leslie for continuing not only to have those fairs where we all get the chance to do this, but they let me be my own producer, writer, actor, and come up with my own stuff. And for the most part, just said, you go do it. We trust you. It's like, where else do you get that opportunity? It's amazing. And it's so full circle, too, because Mark Sellum, your buddy, who you worked with for so many years, we first met each other in 1978 in the Tottenham Halberdiers. We were part of that original group of Tottenham Halberdiers, and then we both went separately to create stage shows and all this stuff. And then what happens? Mark puts on a show for the Dickens Fair on the stage that I'm on every year, and we had host shows going together. And because of COVID, we lost an actor, and he said, hand me the script, I'll go on. And we were able the next day to actually do the show because of that brave, just, I'm going to put it out there and do this thing. And Laura Gregory did the same thing for another actor who was missing. And we had this magical experience. And I hadn't worked with Mark for, 40 years. So it's all full circle. It's all still vibrant. It's all still there.
I think this is a good point to stop recording.
Sounds
So,
good. As you can tell, I've got a lot to say.
no, I have been fascinated and intrigued, and let's see, stop recording. That's my January 2024 interview with Michael Cawelti. If you have questions you'd like me to forward on to Michael, you can email me at djng@earthlink.net. If you have questions for me, you can also email them to me at djng@earthlink.net. If you or anyone you know would like to be a guest on Fair Folk at Work, email me at djng@earthlink.net. But that's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.